Hey, Damian Mason here with a question before we hop into this episode of The Business of Agriculture. If you farm for a living, you employ a lot of amazing technology, from your inputs that you put into the soil to the tractor that you sit in, your combine, and the amazing data that it harvests. But has your soil analytics kept up technologically with everything else in your farming operation? I would venture to say that no, it is not. Sure, you check for your nitrogen, your phosphorus, your potassium, your micronutrients as well. But what about disease pressure? Do you know what diseases and what pests you're going to face next year? No, you don't. But you can now figure that out with Pattern Ag's predictive analytics. Think about it. They can tell you now with testing what the likelihood of facing nasty diseases, things like cyst nematode or sudden death syndrome, what the likelihood of you having this in your field. Then you know how to prepare, how to treat, and where to invest your money. It's using technology to make you bigger yields and therefore make you bigger money. Go to www.pattern.ag to learn more. They are pioneering the way in predictive agronomy. Well, hey there. Thanks for joining us on another fantastic episode of the Business of Agriculture podcast. We have a doozy for you today. We're talking about the meat industry. We're talking about whether or not the meat industry is listening to the consumer. And I'm going to tell you right now, frankly, I don't think the meat industry is listening to the consumer. I've got Neville Spear. He is a former academia type from Western Kentucky University, but he works independently now as a consultant. He decided to get out here in the real world and actually, earn a dollar the old-fashioned way by working. Todd Thurman, my perennial sidekick, Business of Ag Success Group co-host, buddy from Texas. And we don't hold the Texas Tech background against him. He's a pork industry consultant. In fact, tomorrow he's getting on an airplane and he's going to China for a month to work on pork industry developments over there. So we're talking about meat. And this came up the other day, dear listener, going through LinkedIn, and Todd Thurman has a hell of a following on LinkedIn. And he took a picture of a beautiful plate of food, a pork chop in Texas, took his wife out for a date, and he said, "This is an amazing cut. It's from It's a Berkshire," which that became a foodie thing. I talked about it in my book. Berkshire, a breed of hogs that frankly went away because they didn't conform very well with mass production in our confinement systems, but they're more flavorful. So the foodie crowd found them. Todd went on to talk about this to remind the people that are in this industry, we need to bring flavor back. We can disagree whether you think grass-fed, organic, naturally, holistic, whatever your thing is, hormones, no hormones. But the one thing most consumers would agree on, to Todd's point, is that we all want something to actually taste good. So that's spurred on this discussion that we had then with Neville and with Todd and me. The meat industry has favored production over flavor. And I'm going to go on a bunch of different examples of that, but that's the backdrop. Right now, if you're in the meat industry, you're probably already seething. You're probably already mad. Don't be. We are supporters. We are agricultural people. We just know that ultimately we work for a consumer. So Todd, let's go ahead and bring it to you in that post. You got some hate mail a little bit on that, didn't you?
Yeah, a little bit. Not surprising, I guess, but it's just things have developed the way things have developed in the pork industry. I think in a lot of ways, probably the pork industry is the best or worst example, depending on what kind of perspective you want to take with this. But essentially, we had a transition that started in the 70s and it really accelerated in the 80s, where we were getting away from. I think people don't even remember this, but essentially, back in the 50s and 60s, pork was the swine business, I guess, was sort of a two-crop business. A lot like, some sheep, we have wool and meat. We had lard and meat. Those were the two main products, right? And so, but as we made that shift away from animal fats and cooking, the value of that lard obviously went down dramatically and became, instead of a value add, became a liability. And so we started moving towards a leaner product. And I think the fundamental message I was trying to share there on LinkedIn was that we took it too far. We went too far. We got too lean. We took the flavor out of the product. And I think that's basically the fundamental issue that I have. And I think we need to be working back and trying to correct that. We certainly have a tendency in agriculture to swing from one extreme to the other. And I think that's what happened here as we went from, really fat hogs, because we were selling lard as a main commodity. And I think the pendulum has swung too far, and it's time to retract that a little bit and put some fat and some flavor back into the meat.
First off, Neville's over here nodding his head. He's eager to share because we're in agreement. And I want to point this out again. We're not vegetarians here. All three of us eat meat. We're all big proponents of it. We can see it better than folks that are on the ground. I mean, if you're in a barn every day, you focus on growing hogs and et cetera, et cetera. But I'm telling you, we got to always remember, Neville and I were chatting about this when Todd was getting his camera dialed in. We're a consumer business. I always find it interesting when I worked in corporate America 30 years ago, every day, then you'd come in there and say, we're a sales-oriented business. I'm like, well, hell, every business should be a sales-oriented business. If you don't sell, you have no business. Well, in agriculture, we're a sale-oriented business. To sell hogs, to sell beef, to sell chickens, you got to have consumers. And so we have consumers. And then there's this idea that they can't live without us. If you ate today, thank a farmer. I've been on about this a whole bunch. Well, the reality is the consumer has a tremendous amount of choices. They don't have to have pork. They don't have to have beef. They don't have to have chicken. The reality is they've got more choices than they've ever had. We seem to forget that. But anyway, Neville was nodding his head with everything you said. Let's go back to the pork thing. And more importantly, you said bring back fat, bring back flavor. There are some that would say fat doesn't equal flavor. I would disagree that a large component of the flavor and also the tenderness and then obviously the juiciness is derived from the fat. So without the fat on the hogs, we've lost flavor, juiciness, and tenderness. Yes?
Yeah, for sure. And I think there's a couple of different things that play into that. We've got less fat than we used to. That makes everything a little more difficult. We have a legacy of overcooking pork. It goes back to the trichinosis days.
We'll get to that in a minute.
Yes. But that plays into it as well. But I think the combination of those two things is the biggest problem on the pork side.
All right, Neville, you were nodding your head. I feel bad that we couldn't get to you sooner. So you're nodding your head on everything. You want to start with Todd's dinner they took a picture of? By the way, isn't it normally like the foodies or the wannabe chefs are always taking pictures of their food and putting it on social media? And there's Todd, a damn hog consultant, taking pictures of his dinner and talking about his romantic dinner with his wife.
Ask my wife, the quote as I was taking the picture, I said, I don't want to be that guy, but this is a great looking piece of meat right here.
All right, Neville, what do you got? What are your initial thoughts from all of
this? This is great conversation, right? And as I mentioned to you earlier, right? At the end of the day, consumers are the business, right? So just 100%. If we don't have consumers, we're not meeting consumers and what they're demanding, what they need, and keeping up with that, then we don't have a business. We can raise all the livestock we want and produce all the meat, but you've got to have a real life customer at the other side of that paying for it. What's ironic about all this is Todd's talking is, the beef industry really tried to keep up with the pork and the poultry industry through the 80s and the 90s, and we sucked at it, right? We were terrible. And pork and poultry beat the beef industry horribly, right? The beef industry basically got no new spending for 20 years. I mean, we were outpaced by almost 100 to 1 during those 2 decades. And what's interesting is the beef industry kind of forgot about its advantage in the marketplace was taste and flavor.
Yeah.
You know what? We figured that out since then, right? And we've been able to turn that around because we have made beef better. Demand's gotten a lot better here just in the last 10 years, pretty dramatically. And we just saw record spending, consumer spending back, in 2022. So,
that's also because the prices went up. It wasn't because they started eating double.
That's fair, but yeah,
25% inflation on a 25% inflation on a piece of red meat. That does a lot of it.
But what's interesting is we're not seeing a lot of we're getting there, but not seeing a lot of price resistance yet, right? Because it's a better product. We have pricing power.
It's a better product, but beef, Neville, still suffers like many of us in agriculture. Focuses on production and what is favorable for. They've focused on what is favorable for the packer and what is favorable for the producer, and they never wants to ask the consumer. So the product still tastes good. We haven't lost flavor, that's for damn sure. There's a few other things about it I want to get to.
But we've also seen, Damian, kind of push back on that just a little bit. Certified Angus beef just had a record month. March 23 was a record month for them. So we're seeing those kinds of programs and making inroads with the consumer. We've got a long ways to go. What's interesting too, right, Todd, is in all of this, it's not just quality, it's variation in the product too, right? It really makes it challenging. But just one last thought as we tie all this up together. Damon, your point about there's more protein than ever. And, let's also not forget our friends over on the dairy side. Just walk into a convenience store. You're going to find cheese. You're going to find yogurt. You find Fairlife milk and Core Power and all of these things to make a quick meal. Those things are pretty accessible. So, it's a very competitive marketplace right now.
Well, we've always labored under this delusion that the consumer can't live without us and that they'll eat whatever the hell we put in front of them. And for many years, that was true. And I kind of want to go back to Todd's point here. Well, first off, you're a little bit more sing-songy, cheery than I am about the beef thing. I'm going to give you a couple of stats that I think that the consumer has spoken. From Todd's dinner and taking pictures to my dinner. I'm in Las Vegas a week or two ago. My buddies, first trip I've ever taken to Vegas that wasn't for business, believe it or not. And we golfed, drank, ate steak. And there we are at steak. Steaks come. And two of the guys started bitching. There's no way that that's a 16 or 24 ounce steak or what have you. And of course the waiter, and he says, well, absolutely it is. And then he says, why would you think it's not a 16 or 24? I can't remember which cut it was. And the guy says, well, look how thin it is. And so then the waiter goes back and I said, guys, that's absolutely a 16-ounce steak. And he says, well, what do you mean? It's too thin. I said, you might think it's too thin because you like thicker steak, but it's not because it's not the right weight. And he said, well, a 16-ounce steak used to be a hell of a lot thicker than this. And I said, let me tell you about carcass weight. And this is, again, where the industry that we are in focused on what was good for production and what was good for processing. They never thought what the consumer wants. My buddy wants an 1.25 inches to 1.5 inches thick steak. And the thing is, and he had no idea when I explained this to him, I said, we've gone from a 750-pound carcass weight, and that's just 25 years ago. To Todd's point, when hogs used to be a two-product livestock, the beef and the fat, the lard, at that same time, when you saw fat steers, they weighed out about 900 pounds, 1,000 pounds. They were short little guys and they had a lot of fat on them. And also those carcasses right now, if you butcher a 1,450 or 1,500 pound steer, the T-bone on that is the size of a platter. And so for it to stay 16 ounces, because that's all the customer can afford or wants to pay for at a restaurant or that whatever, it's going to be half as thick as it was just 40 years ago. And so I had to explain it to my friends and they said, no, I said, trust me, carcass weights are up about 25% just in the last 30 years. So now, Neville, I'm against that. It worked for the packer. It worked for the processor. The consumer doesn't want a 930-pound carcass weight or a 1,500-pound steer on the hoof. Am I right?
No, you're exactly right. And that is so that's sort of, let's set that, that's a little different category than taste, marbling, flavor.
It's size.
That is certainly a concern that we are constantly grappling with in this industry. Yes.
Todd, you are nodding your head on that because, by the way, nobody's bitching right now about the size of the pork chops, but hogs were 200. When I was a 4-H'er back in the 1980s, a hog was 230 pounds, was a perfect market weight. What are the hogs right now coming off the contract farms that you deal with? 285, 290-pound carcasses?
Yeah, 285 plus.
Yeah, so, 290-pound hoof weight.
Sure. Yeah. And we're definitely as we go back and look at the improvements that we've made in the productivity of our industry, I'm fond of telling people, if you go back and look, since I started in the industry in 1999, we've made tremendous amount of improvement in terms of the amount of pork we're producing. But the majority of that improvement has been in two areas. We have bigger litters and we have bigger carcass weights. Bigger marketing weights. That's about 90% of that improvement has been in those two areas. And so, that's certainly great in terms of efficiency. We've been able to learn how to feed these animals at a heavier market weight and not allow them to get too fat, in the sense that, we've got too much back fat or trim fat, which is not particularly helpful with us. but are able to feed those animals more efficiently. And so that's great in terms of efficiency, but it's not been great in terms of meat quality.
So, by the way, those roughly compare. I just did 60 pounds more on a 230 starting, and you're about 26% bigger. Roughly the same thing on beef in that same, call it the last 40 years. And there's somebody listening to this that's only 25 years old that thinks I'm talking about ancient history. Well, there's a lot of consumers that like to eat meat. They remember that steak being thicker. They don't remember the size. You know what I'm saying? They don't remember the platter size. They just remember that when they started making money, had a good job, and said, by God, I'm going to go out for a good steak once a week now, just 30 years ago. And that steak has gotten a lot more expansive across the plate, meaning it's 25% larger in surface area. And for it to remain 16 ounces, it's going to be half an inch thinner. And which is not listening to the consumer at all, because I don't
also
think
makes it much more challenging to get cooked correctly.
You mean by being thinner?
Yes.
Oh, you'll burn the hell. You want a medium rare and it's only a half an inch thick. That's like a minute steak. That's honestly like a flip and then put it on the plate, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. It's a challenge.
What I want to get into where this thing goes. And before I do that, I want to remind you, if you are in the business of agriculture, you probably spend time looking for information. You can go on ag Twitter and be ridiculed by everybody that thinks they're a know-it-all genius on Twitter. Or you can actually put an app on your phone called AgVisor Pro. It's very simple. A friend of mine, entrepreneurial ag guy named Rob Syke, looked around and said, farmers spend 19% of their time looking for this information. So you know what? AgVisor Pro, put it on your phone. It's simple. It's easy. Just go on your app store, put AgVisor Pro, and then you'll have answers from agricultural experts on your phone. But you know what? Don't take my word for it. Take this guy who's a Canadian farmer who loves AgVisor Pro.
We were sitting on the fence about booking the rest of our fertilizer, but after one quick session with Mo Augustino, that really just kind of gave us the kick that we needed and to finalize the rest of our booking. In a week or so, the price rallied $100-$200 a ton and subsequently saved us over $70,000.
Thanks, AgVisor Pro, for being a part of the business of agriculture. All right, first off, we've got two different things here. On the Todd side, talking about hogs, we're talking about flavor, and we've bred the fat out of them. On the beef side, as Neville and I are talking about, flavor's there, just too big of a cut on steaks anyhow. Burger's fine because it's just ground up. Your roasts are huge. Your steaks, though, are just enormous. And then also let's bring up chicken, the really white meat, the one that doesn't even have a checkoff program. All they've ever said, if we want to sell more chicken, let's be cheap. Pork's out here marketing, beef's out here marketing. Hell, avocados have a marketing checkoff program, not to mention milk, which has the biggest of all the checkoff marketing programs. But you know what chicken says? We're not going to take a checkoff program. Let's just be cheap. And they are. But you know what else? They're also enormous. I read an article 6 months ago. A foodie that has an online following was bitching about these chicken breasts have become unruly. Same problem there, Neville. Chicken breasts are about 2.5 times. They didn't stop at 26%. They're 2 to 2.5 times what they were 40, 50 years ago.
For sure. Yeah. And that's led to a lot of issues. For example, woody breast, right? I mean, where that really gets to be a challenge from a consumer perspective.
Which thing does?
Woody breast.
Oh,
where you get these, just really tough parts of the breast, and it's inedible. So it's, So I think it's like Todd said, right? We're very good at pushing up to the edge of the envelope and then maybe stepping over a little too far, right? We're really good at that.
Well, we're now at a point, Todd. Some of the foodie stuff that I've read, they're talking about now taking a chicken breast, it's one on the other, and then cutting it again to use the same amount of stuff. It's hard to do that with a steak. Again, what we've done there is just keep making them thinner. Pork doesn't have quite as bad of a problem because the chops haven't gotten so unruly that it can't still be a dinner. Where does this go? You're the consultant. Where does this go? Start with whichever species you want. You're the pork guy, but you can take one of the others. Take the chicken, if you will.
Well, I think the way it goes, and what we're really talking about here at a fundamental level is we're talking about consumers that have a lot more options than they used to have. You mentioned that earlier. And so all of a sudden, when it's, I was in Ghana a few weeks ago, and there is a demand for meat, right? So the discussion there was, if I can get more meat, I'm meeting with a processor there, and he says, if I can get more meat, I can sell it, right? So there's a demand for meat. When there's a shortage of meat protein that people need, they're consuming 1 kilo of pork a year, but the demand is enormous, right? There's just not a supply. In that environment, you produce meat as cheaply and as economically as possible, right, and at scale, right? Now, what we're really seeing here, I think, is essentially what amounts to an oversupply of meat in developed countries. And as that has developed, people have decided, okay, I want to be more particular about what kind of meat I want to consume. And so that takes many shapes, as you alluded to before. Some people say, okay, I've got some extra money to spend. There's plenty of options out there. I'm going to demand as a consumer that I want pork raised without antibiotics, or I want grass finished beef as opposed to grain finished beef, or whatever that is. Chasing after those niches can get a little tiring, but the one thing that I think everybody has in common is they want it to taste good. And so I think that's where we're moving, and it really is part of this meta trend that we've been talking about, moving away from a chronic shortage of food in general and protein in specific to plentiful supply. And what does that look like? What does the demand look like? And I think it means meeting consumer demands that they didn't really have the ability to exercise before.
That's a mindset issue, and it's obviously it's a categorical based on what kind of a country you live in. If you're in Canada or the United States, where most of my listeners are, they don't even still like to hear you say where we are oversupplied. But the reality is, compared to Ghana, we have boatloads of meat in the United States and Canada, right? And so, whereas in Ghana, you will probably be less discerning because you just want protein. Here, you want protein that tastes good. You want protein that fits your moral compass about how it was raised or where it was raised or what its diet was, et cetera, et cetera. We still, frankly, have, in large part, a Ghana production mentality in a country that's nothing like Ghana. Neville's nodding his head.
Yeah, Damien, I think that's exactly right. And Todd was going where I was going to go is, really a lot of this, let's say 40 years ago, it was price-based, right? We were driven in a production system, lower the cost of protein. The marketplace has gotten exponentially more complicated just in the last 15 years because of all of these different kinds of demands. The customer is far more segmented than he ever's been before, right? Mm-hmm. There's a lot of different needs, and it's very hard to take a big production system and kind of meet all of those needs with precision as well as maybe we should.
Well, what we've generally done is focused on just massiveness and bigger and bigger. My God. So let's go to where this thing goes. The players in the industry are generally four great big ones, whether you talk about meat processing or production, whatever. So the reality is they think we'll do what's working for us. And let's talk about beef in that regard. I mean, there's four companies that control 80-some% of all the beef that's processed in the country. And they have no real motivation to change. What would motivate them to finally go back to a carcass weight that we want as consumers? A 1,200-pound fat steer as opposed to a 1,500-pound fat steer coming out of the feed yards in Nebraska. What would cause that to happen, Neville?
I think if you get enough pushback from the retailers and HRI business and you begin to really hear complaints, I mean, those price signals are going to come back pretty quickly. We're not quite there yet. And then, let's just take the beef industry, right? We're working into the next 3 or 4 years. We're going to see big declines in supply.
Yeah.
So that becomes a little even more challenging in that. But I think you're starting to kind of see a little more rumbling of kind of alignment of supply chains into end users and to meet some of these specifications that you're talking about.
It's my opinion that the beef people are the most bullheaded. You know what, Todd? They put on their cowboy hats. You're a Texas guy. Try and tell a Texas rancher that his product it needs improvement. Oh, Jesus. They can't stand it. They can't stand it. Whereas I think the pork is probably more responsive. The thing is, they respond with longer. They responded to we need leaner hogs, like you said, starting in the 70s. Them. Face it, some of the little pigs that I saw in 4-H back then, they were a little too skinny, right? They were a little too. So then we beefed them up, and now they're like bodybuilders and ain't got no fat on them. Is pork going to adjust and bring back fat? Because you got pushback about that on your LinkedIn post by someone in our industry that said, well, it ain't going to happen because it costs money to put fat on hogs, and the packers won't pay it.
Well, that's not an unfair, pushback, right? And I think it speaks to the way the incentives are aligned. And this is another.
When I said that beef people were a bunch of bullheaded peckers, I was talking about Neville. Would you jump in on that? Would you concur?
Yeah, I mean, making change in the beef industry is incredibly tedious, right? I mean, it is mindset, fragmented, segmented business. It is.
It's also, as opposed to pork, and maybe that's where pork and Todd's going to go with this. They can move a little bit more in unison because it's so much more of a vertically integrated system. If all of a sudden they say we got to put some fat on there, but let's talk about the fat.
And they're sharing data across the supply chain and communication. Beef industry largely does not do that.
Right.
Yeah.
I think that's definitely the case, and I think the comparison between beef and pork is this is another good example. The one thing that they've retained in beef is that flavor because they incentivize that. Just look at the grading system and the feedback that you give to producers. The feedback that you give to producers is we want marbling, we want meat quality. And meat quality is a little bit of a loaded term in pork because it means different things to different people, but that is fundamentally the problem. The beef people know what quality looks like.
Todd, that's something that we hadn't even thought about because we're so close to it. When I'm with my suburban friends and they say, well, I'm going to have the Angus because the Angus is better. I'm like, well, maybe it's a lot of marketing and I'm not bashing on the breed, but I said, what was the grade? Huh? Because we know Prime, Choice, Select, et cetera, and the average consumer still doesn't quite comprehend that generally Prime and Choice meant more marbling and more fat content right now.
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
And so, and then on the pork side, it's really the exact opposite, to be honest with you. I mean, all the incentives are around lean. On the nutrition side, we always talk about lean gain. We talk about you get a lean bonus when you ship, sometimes when you ship those animals to market. So it's all about lean gain. So once the incentives are aligned as an industry, we are really good at developing production strategies to capture those incentives. And so at the end of the day, the guy that pushed back on my post and said, well, until the Packers pay for it, it's not going to happen. He's got a fair point. We have to figure out as an industry how to align those incentives with consumer demand. Yeah.
Your point, Todd, was right now there's no paying for fat, whereas on beef, if you sell a truckload of steers and you sell it on the grid, is that what they call it, Neville?
Yeah, that's right. Yep.
And selling them on the grid means they get graded, and then you'll get a premium for Choice and Prime, which of course means more marbling, more fat. And that's not happening in pork right now. Will it?
And also a discount if they don't.
Oh yeah,
and it's exactly
the discount part. Yeah,
and it's exactly the opposite on pork. Yeah. You get a lower back fat, and back fat and marbling are correlated, but not the same thing, right? So the back fat is not necessarily good, unless you're selling lard, but it is correlated. It tends to be correlated with intramuscular fat, which is what we're really looking for. And so as you see that, part of what the beef industry has done quite a good job of is improving the intramuscular fat without adding a ton of unnecessary trim fat. But that has happened over many years, and they genetically selected those animals for that purpose. So what we get incentivized to do is to minimize back fat. right? Well, if we're going to minimize back fat, we not necessarily intentionally are going to reduce intramuscular fat as well. And so that's essentially what's happened. And it's going to continue to happen until we change the incentive structure.
All right. Well, answer me this. Is it going to happen? I mean, we're all three sitting here saying, I prefer a pork chop that has fat on it. I prefer stuff not be dry. I like flavor, but are we talking about what we like? And then the industry says, yeah, that's great. You know what? You also like rainbows. We don't. I mean, what does it matter?
I think it's going to have to change. There was a post on LinkedIn that I reposted this morning that showed profits, live production profits, wean to finish, and pork from, I think, 2002 to last year. So 20 years. And it's a really ugly chart. And I would
like $1. I saw it. By the way, dear listener, Todd Thurman spends 4 hours a day on LinkedIn. He's like your daughter. He's like your teenage daughter at the dinner table who won't put the phone down. That's Todd on LinkedIn. All right. So what was it? Something like $1.46 per.
We averaged over 20 years $1.50 a head in profit. $1.50 a head in profit. And so we look around and I think, to answer your question, is this going to change? I think it has to change. And I've been saying for a while to our industry, there's three characteristics of our industry that I don't think are sustainable. And that is, we are a capital intensive business, and we are a highly volatile business, and we have low margins. At least one of those three things has got to change. And the most obvious way to change that is to increase margins. And if we're going to increase margins, we have to start producing a product that people are willing to pay more for. So I think ultimately that's going to be the lever. And I think we're at a point where I don't know how much longer we can keep going with this. I mean, we're in a situation. The other thing I mentioned in that post is the average manure value was actually higher over that time period than the value of the pork. And so I think that should be a sign that maybe we've got some problems when the manure is worth more than the meat. Something is not aligned, and we just can't keep doing what we're doing. I keep telling the industry what got us here is not going to get us there. We've got a lot of really old facilities out there that need to be replaced, that are not being replaced because there's not enough margin in here to attract investment.
Neville, on the beef side, at least we got flavor right. I read a book called The Dorito Effect by a guy named Mark Schatzker. He also wrote a book called Steak. I've read both of them. He's a foodie and a food author. And he was led to this thing called the Dorito Effect. And his entire theme throughout the book is how we've, as an industry, not just ag, he's talking about it, processed foods, et cetera. Real flavor is gone away with artificial flavoring, right? And so his point was a corn chip has no flavor until you made it the Dorito. And so that's kind of, and he talks about tomatoes, of course. And he talks a lot. He references Julia Childs, if you're old enough to remember, the famous British.
Sure, yeah.
Broke shit, and you couldn't understand what she said in the kitchen, but everybody tuned in to watch this husky British woman cook. Anyway, she talked a lot about how modern chickens taste like teddy bear stuffing compared to the old days. That's a little harsh, but there is something to be said here. Beef is the one that is stuck with flavor. Their flaw is they've got cuts that are so large that my wife can't eat a steak. Yeah. You can't get a steak small enough for her to actually finish. My buddies are pissed off because it's a 1/2 to 3/4 inch thick steak and it covers the plate. Beef stuck with flavor but got the other parts wrong. Pork stuck with efficiency and has a great product that also has no taste and kind of went the way of chicken. Chicken has gotten so big that now foodies are talking about the chicken breast not only is flavorless, you got to bisect it into 3 pieces, whereas you used to use 1 chicken breast. So where's this go?
So, well, I think one of the things that's really important in all of this conversation is you never, no matter what business you're in, you can never lose sight of your customers, right? And anything you don't do right in the meat business going forward means you're giving the millennials, who are the coming wave of consumers and all the spending power, a reason to walk away. Mm-hmm. So anytime I go out and do presentations, like it's more important to get everything right for the consumer more now than ever, right? Because the boomers and the Gen X's, they are going to eat meat no matter what. The millennials, they're willing to walk away. They're willing to do something else. They're flexitarians. If they don't eat meat, they don't care. And they're not as committed to the meat, the protein business as previous generations. And so all of these topics are really important. And the problem is in this is, boy, you wake up one day and you realize I've lost my customer, right? And that's, let's go back to the beef industry. Too often in our business, we forget those 20 years, no new spending. By the way, think about 1980. That was an inflationary period, no new spending. We're going backwards.
You're talking about on the promotion or on development? Or are you talking about the consumer?
Both. Yeah, just a consumer, no new spending. Okay. Right? You can't grow a business if you're not getting new dollars coming in.
The reality is we're going to have globally slower economic growth and quite soon, as we've talked about many times, Damien, a declining population. And so selling more meat is not the way to continue forward. We're going to have to come to the realization that we are going to have to sell less meat for more money, right? And at the end of the day, that's where this thing is going. It's a shift away from quantity to quality, and that's what we're going to have to find, whether that's on the beef side. And the trends are there. The underlying trends are there. It's obvious. I mean, look at those high growth areas on the beef side. It's in this Wagyu product. It's in this. I don't buy any more hamburgers than I used to, but you know what I started buying? Brisket burgers. And if nobody's never tried that, that's definitely the way to go.
So you buy better burgers.
Yeah, they're more expensive, but they're better quality, and that's the way you can continue to grow the business. And that's the approach that we need to take moving forward, is how do we sell less meat for more money.
By the way, there's right now the person which ag is prone to do, dismiss anything that disagrees with how you do things. In other words, yeah, well, you can go ahead and talk about that all you want, but I'm still going to go out and moldboard plow just like Dad did, because it's always worked. You know what I mean? There is a prevailing, screw you, I don't like what you're saying, and it's going to cause me to change what I'm doing, so I won't, you're an idiot. And right now that dismissive personality is also saying, yeah, well, it's easy for Todd to say. He's an international consultant, makes a lot of money. He can afford brisket burgers or Berkshire pork chops. What about everybody else? We tend to think that every consumer is poor, and that is fundamentally, in a country like the U.S. or in Canada, wrong, right?
Absolutely.
Well, and even in a lot of countries that we would consider to be developing countries. I mean, the fastest growth area in China right now is in premium meats. Yeah. Those consumers, especially in the urban centers, have the disposable income, and they're seeing very similar trends to what we're seeing. I talked about the Wagyu trend on the beef side. Look at pork. I'm a big critic of the Other White Meat campaign, but that was launched in 1987. The per capita pork consumption in 1987 was 29 kilos per person in the U.S. Today, or actually in 2021, last numbers I have were 2021, it was 29 kilos per person. It's exactly the same last year as it was in 1987. It never got above 31. It never got below 27. So this is one of the five most memorable, according to a Northwestern University study, one of the five most memorable advertising campaigns in history, and it failed to make any impact on per capita pork consumption. But the one thing that has changed significantly over that time is bellies. The fattest cut of meat is the only one that's really growing. It's been growing consistently year over year.
Yeah, bacon. By the way, Neville, I think you're probably with me. Simple Kentucky guy like you, simple Indiana farm boy like me. When I find people in a discussion that use metric system terms, I find them to be pretentious. Like they want to show off that they talk like Europeans. And it was 29 kilos, and then it grew to 31. It's about 50 pounds, damn it. It's about 50 pounds of pork consumed.
I worked with Canadians for 5 years. Yeah, I never got adjusted over to that.
It's about 50 pounds of pork consumed per American per year. But here's the thing, in all seriousness, there's going to be the people that listen to this and dismiss what we say and say, well, those guys can afford better, meat and nobody else can. And that's fundamentally wrong. We know that there's a huge segment that will pay. Whole Foods would not exist if it was all about price. Trader Joe would not exist, especially meat businesses. For God's sakes, there's a company called Good Ranchers. I just found out about them on Sunday because I was watching the IndyCar race. I'm a big IndyCar fan, and they sponsored the winner, Scott McLaughlin. I looked them up. It's a direct-to-consumer meat company that looks to be telling the story of regenerative and sustainable. Well, trust me, if you're buying stuff from Good Ranchers, it's not because it's cheaper than the 80% lean, 20% fat tube of ground beef at Walmart, right? So there's that. But the other thing is on beef, you said, Neville, we're going into a slow cycle. For somebody that's not in the beef business, they don't probably have as much familiarity. Beef goes in cycles because it's such a long time from breeding a cow, 9-month gestation. She has the calf. The calf comes out. It takes minimum 15 months to get it to where it's ready to be butchered, probably more like 16 to 17 month on average. There's a long lag. Right now, we're cowed down because of some drought issues the last 2 years. So beef doesn't have to make any changes for the next 3 to 5 years, and they're still going to sell everything they have. So what's the motivation to change?
Well, I think you're increasingly, what's interesting that we haven't talked about in this conversation, the retailer is increasingly seeing fresh, right? Protein, produce as the driver of store loyalty, right? Kroger, whoever, they want to get you into that store repeatedly. Okay.
You mean you're saying fresh? It's not the dog food aisle. It's not the frozen pizza aisle. It's fresh meat and fresh produce are the two drivers.
Absolutely, and that's ultimately what drives store loyalty. And retailers are actually willing to eat some margin there to get you in the store because they're going to make all their money down the aisle somewhere else.
Yeah.
Right. And Walmart figured that out pretty quickly, and they're working hard at it, but everybody else is too. And that's ultimately where you drive change. Yeah. Okay.
So there's no motivation right now for the beef to move. I think it's going to be such a mindset change to tell them, oh, yeah, those 1,450, 1,500 pound steers, we want them back down to 1,200 pounds. I don't think any feed yard's going to want to. I think you'd almost have to go out there with some sort of force to make that to happen. Do you think that's going to happen on its own?
No. In fact, I think we're going to continue to get bigger. Yeah.
What about chickens?
Yeah.
Todd, what about chickens? Chickens are honestly about 2.5 times the size they were like in the 1960s, the last article I read. Do chickens get smaller, or do we still have 6.5 to 8 pound broilers?
I don't know that they're going to get smaller. I think maybe this pace of growth is going to slow down. The chickens have some really huge built-in advantages that we don't have on the pork side, or certainly on the beef side. And that is that they can make changes very quickly. My other criticism of the Other White Meat program is you're competing against chicken at their own game, and you can't beat them at that. I mean, their feed conversion is 1.6. And they go to market in 45 days. So,
well, we talked about it on our Business of Ag Success group the other day, and I said, I think it's one of the stupidest campaigns that's ever happened. The Other White Meat. We're a lot like chicken. We're flavorless, but we're not as cheap. That's like saying, hey, we're a lot like Walmart, but we have less stuff and we're more expensive.
We're stuck in the middle, right?
Yeah. Hey, we're just like Walmart. We have the same products as Walmart, but we're more expensive and we don't have as much of it. And like, well, then why the hell would I not just go to Walmart? It's kind of the chicken and the white meat on the pork thing. So what about flavor on them hogs? When we talk about these changes, it's harder when 4 companies control. When you've got Smithfield or Tyson or whatever, there's not a big motivation to then start bringing fat back on hogs. But maybe if I go to 10 years down the road, what has changed?
Well, the pressure from the live production side is where that $1.50 a head margin that we were talking about is really, I think, what is in tandem with consumer demand is what's going to force a change, because these producers are not going to continue to be able to do this. I was at a barn the other day that's 37 years old. When they built that barn, they probably hoped to get 15 years out of it.
Yeah, right.
And the ceiling is literally about to fall in. There are a lot of those facilities that were built in the early 90s that are still in operation right now, and they're not going to last forever. We've gotten a lot more years out of them than we thought we were ever going to, but they're not going to last forever. And eventually, if you're going to invest to build new facilities, then you're going to have to have better margins. So we're going to have to figure out a way to share that margin more equitably within the supply chain. But overall, we've got to generate higher margin products. And the only way to do that is to meet consumer demand in a way that they're willing to pay for.
Is there going to be two different categories of processing, Neville, where there's the standard national, go to Dodge City, Kansas, it's still going to be the exact same thing. 20,000 head of beef cattle get killed per day there, and it just is the same thing. And there's going to be another place that says we're bringing in smaller carcassed animals. There's more fat on them. It's more like the steak your grandpa ate. Is that going to happen?
Well, it's really hard to make margins work in that kind of business. I mean, there's some of that, right? And everybody's talking about regional packers and some of those smaller ones. But at the end of the day, and what's your biggest challenge as a packer? It's labor.
Yeah, right.
And so you've got to maximize throughput for labor, right?
So another question then.
Really hard to change. Yeah.
We posed the question, is the meat industry listening to the consumer? Todd's not complaining. He's voicing his preference. We're not complaining. I'm not complaining. My buddies in Vegas are, because the steak's not thick. But are we the only consumers that are actually doing this? Because maybe the meat industry is saying, hey, our consumers aren't unhappy. I'm wondering.
No, I think they're definitely complaining. They're not able to meet the demand. You go talk to the restaurateurs, you go talk to the retail people. They're not able to meet the demand for that higher end product. And so I think that's going to continue to put pressure. And again, these are slow changes. And I think one of the misconceptions, I think, is that we have to do this inefficiently. Right. We can retain a lot of that efficiency. We can make changes genetically, especially with some of the tools that we have available now. The method for doing that, we can produce large pigs relatively efficiently that were much better meat quality than what we're typically coming off the line today. We just have to align those incentives and then start applying that genetic pressure. And we can do that much quicker than we used to be able to through genomics. We can make those changes pretty quickly. So we're not talking about going back to a 230-pound hog. We're talking about producing a 285-pound hog in a few extra days with a little bit more feed that's got a lot more marbling and a lot more
flavor. By the way, Neville, you said you get up and do presentations for your audiences and you tell them that what is it? There is no
consumers are the business.
Consumers are the business. All right.
And I tell people that all. If you raise cows,
yep,
consumers are your business.
Right. So answer me this: are the consumers? Todd says the consumer is demanding something, and he says that if you talk to chefs or restaurateurs or maybe even retailers, maybe there is an actual consumer saying, "Damn it, I want something better." Are you seeing it? Is beef seeing it?
Yes. I mean, these very things you're talking about, like in terms of carcass size, cut size, actually, and customers talking about entire cost of a package, that becomes a challenge. So yes, this is certainly, we've been hearing this. Yeah, for sure.
It's just that the beef people are more stubborn, Todd. I mean, if I had and I'm a beef guy, but I'd probably more.
Well, but pretty much all of the advantages that I talked about that the chicken industry has, it's exactly the opposite for the beef.
Exactly.
Right. So, in terms of feed efficiency, in terms of growth rate, in terms of,
you can't take a calf and have it ready to butcher in 43 days the way you can a chicken.
Right. So and when they make changes, it happens more slowly, right? There's less iterations, so it happens.
You can get like 3 generations a year with a chicken, and to get 3 generations with cattle, you need like 5 years, right?
Right. And not only that, it's go back to all the signals are fragmented, right? They don't get communicated seamlessly through the system. And by the way, Let's also not forget, we have a lot of beef producers who are in the business not necessarily for business sake.
You mean on the beef side, as opposed to nobody has a chicken barn for the hell of it. Nobody has a hog barn just for the hell of it. Somebody has 27 cows on 61 non-tillable acres, and they don't even think that it's a business.
Well, actually, 70% of producers, cow-calf producers, even large producers, cows are a secondary source of income.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. And what percentage of those operations are profitable?
Oh, yeah. What you're in is you're in the real estate investment business. You just happen to have cows.
Right? Out on a pasture. That's the interesting thing right there. So tell me, what's the motivation to breed for smaller frame size and more profit if you've got 41 cows on your rough acres, and it's mostly so you can drive out there on your Polaris Ranger and drink a beer and look at them at night? Yes. I mean, that's a true story, right?
Of course it is, right? Over and over and over again.
Interesting dog. All right. His name's Neville Spear. He's a member of the Business of Ag Success Group. He's a consultant, and he's a beef guy, Turkey Track Consulting. You can find him on LinkedIn. And when you're over there on LinkedIn, you can look up Todd Thurman. He's the guy who has 18 posts a day. Again, he's like your teenage daughter who won't put her phone down at dinner when it comes to LinkedIn. It's almost like I'm worried when he's in China that he's going to have to he's like a junkie with a smack. He's not going to be able to have his LinkedIn fix over there. Anyway, he's with Swine Test Consulting. He's also the co-host of our Business of Ag Success Group. If you want to advance your ag career, you might consider joining the Business of Ag Success Group. It's only $99 a month. It's a network of ag professionals. We have smart, intelligent discussions like this every other Friday on a Zoom call with guest industry people that come on and talk to us. So anyway, check it out. You can go to thenewdamianmason.com and find all that and more. Connect with both of these two dudes. Your life will be better for it. Till next time, Neville and Todd, I appreciate you being here.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Till next time, I'm Damian Mason, and this is The Business of Agriculture. Hey, thanks for being here. This episode of The Business of Agriculture was brought to you by Pattern Ag. You've heard me talk about Pattern Ag because I think it's a pretty cool concept. New technology that allows you to predict the problems you're going to have and therefore treat them before those problems cost you money. What kind of problems am I talking about? Pests and disease. Things like cordon rootworm, sudden death syndrome, cyst nematode, and a whole bunch of other bad things that happen out there in the field that can cost you money. Guess what? Pattern Ag will let you find out ahead of time if the disease or the pest pressure is there, and therefore you're treating it before it costs you any money. What a great concept. Go to pattern.ag, that's www.pattern.ag, to learn more about their product, their technology, how it can make you money, save you yield, and also where you can find a rep that can come out there and do the work for you. Pattern.ag.